I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I went to college in California. I went to Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. I started in the autumn of 1971. And when I went there, Palo Alto was a quiet community in what was called the South Bay. It's toward the southern end of the San Francisco Bay. Sometimes it was called the Santa Clara Valley. Santa Clara was the largest city nearby. This is about 50 miles south of San Francisco, so it's between San Francisco and Santa Clara. And nobody made any particularly big deal of this particular region. It was sort of a stretch of suburbs that ran from San Francisco down San Francisco Bay to Santa Clara and then San Jose. And so San Jose was just beyond Santa Clara. And I used to go on bicycle rides from my dormitory. I lived in a dormitory as a freshman. And I would ride around the area, and I'd ride around Palo Alto. And one of the roads that borders the Stanford campus on the north side is Sand Hill Road. And I'd ride along Sand Hill Road, and it was a very quiet road. There wasn't much traffic on it. There was a bike lane on one side, which was nice. It was one of the reasons I rode on there. And there were these buildings that were on the sides of the road, and they were very nondescript. And for the most part, they seemed to be, and I guess they were, offices of dentists and insurance agents. It didn't look like there was much interesting going on there. It's just, sort of the kind of thing you'd expect of an office park. And I'd ride into the hills behind the campus, and the Sand Hill Road was one of the ways to get there. And I just went back and forth along the road, and as I say, I didn't think anything of it. When I was, I think I was a freshman, I might have been a sophomore, I got a job, I got a part-time job off campus. And I worked at middle school. At this time, I was sort of thinking maybe I'd want to be a teacher one day, and I thought, okay, well, I'll work in a school and see if I like it. So I got a job as, I was kind of a proctor of lunchtime in the middle school library. Junior high is what they called them at the time. And so every day, Monday through Friday, I'd get on my bike and I would ride through Palo Alto. It was a very nice ride, and it's a beautiful part of the world to live in. And I'd ride through the streets of Palo Alto, and I'd go to this school, and I'd work for an hour and a half there, and I'd ride home. And I often would eat my lunch while riding on my bike, to and from. And I'd look at the houses that I passed by, and okay, they were just modest bungalows, probably built in the 1940s and 1930s. And so this is, the early 1970s. And again, so didn't think too much of it. But there was a bit of lore around the campus and around Palo Alto. And it had to do with two guys who had started an electronics company. And the electronics company was called HewlettPackard. It's named for William Hewitt and David Packard. And the two of them had started their company in the garage of one of the houses along one of the streets that I was riding along. And I didn't know exactly what house it was, but Hewlett-Packard at that time was not a huge deal. It was a modest-sized electronics company. It originally made things like oscilloscopes and pretty technical stuff. Now, later on, Hewlett-Packard would become HP, which is still around and is a big deal. But it was seen as one of the first examples of college professors using their knowledge to start a company and to kind of leverage the advantage of the research that's done in universities into this new field, the field of high technology stuff. This was, so the early 1970s, this was about 15 years after the invention of the transistor. And the transistor is the tiny little bit of electronics that's at the heart of every computer and smartphone. And now there are millions and millions and billions of them crammed onto single chips. But in those days, it was still a relatively novel technology. But the fact that Hewlett and Packard had used some of this information and created this company was seen as, oh, hey, this is good. This is the kind of thing that an enterprising university like Stanford University ought to encourage. Okay, so I was just I knew vaguely about this. I was casually on the lookout for where this particular garage was. I don't know that I ever actually found it. I'm sure there was no historical marker sign or anything like that in front of it. But anyway, it was just kind of curious. And while I was in college, I took some classes. I obviously took classes, but I took classes in computer science. And I took a course in computing, and what we would call it now is coding. Learned how to write computer programs. And the computers that we used were these huge mainframes that filled up entire rooms. And directions, the code was entered not on a keyboard, but it was entered via data punch cards. So there, in this big room, there were the equipment looked like a whole bunch of typewriters, except the typewriters didn't produce type on paper. They produced these punch cards. And the cards would then be put in a stack, and you had to be careful that you put them in the right order. And each card was a line of code. And for the the first programs, there might be just 10 lines of code. You just do something really simple. But eventually you'd get these programs that would be 100 lines of code, 500 lines of code, something like that. And it was the nightmare of any student that he or she would be walking across campus with this stack of the punch cards, and they might trip or run into by a bike, and the cards would fly all over the place, because then you'd have to very painstakingly put them back in the right order. Anyway, this was before the beginning of what people today would recognize as the modern computer revolution. There were no personal computers in those days. However, if I had known that something else was going on in a garage near the neighborhood that I was riding through, a different garage, and different people, not Hewlett and Packard, but Jobs and Wozniak, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs he's now deceased, he was a couple years younger than me. And he was still in high school when I started college. And I didn't know this because nobody but his parents and his very close friends knew it at the time, that he and Steve Wozniak, a friend, were at work on what would become one of the first personal computers, something that an individual could own and an individual could operate and could program and could use to do worthwhile tasks. And they were creating what would become the first Apple computer. Now, nobody knew this because Steve Jobs was a nobody. He was considered a smart kid in his high school, but he was a little bit of a strange character. He didn't fit into any of the particular niches or the cliques. He was kind of a techie, kind of a nerd, but he also had a literary bent. And he had a strong sense of, what shall I say, rebellion. He didn't take direction very well. And he was also experimenting with things like various drugs that were illegal and eventually LSD. And so he was an odd character. He's a bit of a counterculture type, but also a techie. But nobody knew anything about him. And I say all this to say that, and I say this with particular desire to make myself look cool or anything, but I was there at the beginning of what would become Silicon Valley, except I didn't know it. And nobody knew it. There were a few people who thought that maybe this model of Hewlett and Packard and the HewlettPackard Corporation would be a good one. And it leveraged the advantage of having a university nearby, because universities attract smart people. And the key for the companies is that they don't have to pay the smart people to come. The university provides them jobs, But the companies, the startup companies, the ones that are want to get going, they can get them part-time. And they can also get clever graduate students. And the graduate students are paid by, it could be the computer science department or the electrical engineering department or whatever. But there was this talent that came for the university, for the education of the university, but kind of stuck around and as a part-time gig made these inventions and spun off these companies. And so this was something that was going to happen, but nobody knew it was going to happen. And nobody, first of all, nobody knew it was going to happen. And even if they had known it was going to happen, nobody knew quite where it was going to happen. But over the 50 years since then, almost 50 years since then, Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. It became this very famous place. It became the center of the modern tech revolution. It became this magnet for the best technical talent from all over the world. And I can tell you that the houses along those streets in Palo Alto that I used to ride by, that I'm going to guess when I was riding by them, you could probably buy one of those houses for $25,000. And I realized, prices go up generally, but nothing like this. Now those houses sell for $3 or $4 million because people want to be in Silicon Valley. The name Silicon Valley apparently was coined by some real estate promoter, somebody who wanted to point out to the world that there is this interesting thing going on here and draw attraction to it. And silicon comes from the material that's used as the basis for the computer chips that underlay all of this. But as I say, at the time it was either called the South Bay or the Santa Clara Valley. Okay, so even by the time I got out of college in 1975, still there was no Apple computer, there was no Microsoft yet. I should point out, there was another guy who was busy working on things, and his name was Bill Gates, and he was working on software. He was writing computer code. And he was going to become a star in this new tech revolution before Steve Jobs would. And Bill Gates and a buddy of his would create Microsoft. And Microsoft, of course, is a huge player today. And I should just point out that I just happened to look at the latest stock valuations, and Apple Corporation is the most highly valued company in the history of the world. Right now it's worth around $2 trillion. Microsoft is a close second. So these companies, they emerged out of this tech revolution of the 1970s, 1980s, and they're still around today. They're the biggest players in the corporate universe today. But here's the question. Here's the question that I pose to students of history. Was there anything particularly inevitable about, first of all, this tech revolution? And then secondly, was there anything inevitable about the fact that it was going to be centered on this part of the southern region of San Francisco Bay? Was Silicon Valley going to be in Silicon Valley? Might it have been somewhere else? And for this, I'm reminded of something else that I encountered when I was in college. And again, I had no idea what was going to come of all of this, but later when it did happen, I started to put what seemed to me two and two together. So on the Stanford campus, there is a museum. It's a museum devoted to the Stanford family. The formal name of the university is Leland Stanford Junior University. And at first when I heard this, I thought, wait, junior university is just like a junior college? I don't want to go to junior college. No, it was named for Leland Stanford Jr., who died as a young man. And in his memory, his father, Leland Stanford, who was a railroad tycoon from the days of the California Gold Rush, he was one who was responsible for building the first transcontinental railroad. So there was this Stanford Museum, and it was a historical museum, a museum of the area, a museum of the university, a museum of the Stanford family. And in an idle moment, I went and visited the museum just to see what was in the museum, and I was struck by the fact that one of the prize exhibits in the museum was a railroad spike. It's about this long, and if you happen to walk on railroad tracks today, if they're old railroad tracks, you can see that they still, at least until fairly recently, they use spikes like this, these long spikes that they would drive to hold, they're kind of flanged on the end, and they hold the rails against the cross ties, the wooden pieces. Now they're often concrete, and they hold them down. And so these spikes are what sort of are necessary to complete the railroad. And this railroad spike was made out of gold. Gold? Really? You don't find these in railroads, just here, there, and everywhere. This was a special spike. This was the spike that was driven to complete the construction of America's first transcontinental railroad that was finished in 1869. And Leland Stanford was one of the principals in constructing that railroad. And so he was the one who claimed the gold spike. Now, the reason it was gold, well, gold, of course, is valuable and makes it special, but it was gold because it was gold from California. The reason that there was a transcontinental railroad is that there had been a gold rush in California. And California filled up with people much more rapidly than anybody had guessed. And it was to make sure that these people, the state of California, stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War, that Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 that said there's going to be this railroad to California. So there's this connection to California, there's a connection to the gold rush, there's a connection to the Stanford family. And for that reason, the gold spike was in the Stanford Museum. And I looked at it and, it's interesting. I mean, gold is attractive, but there it was a spike. It was about this same time, I think again, it was probably in my first year in college, that I visited the gold fields, the gold country in California. With some friends, I went for a camping trip to Yosemite National Park in Yosemite Valley. But it's in the region where gold miners dug out their gold in 1849, 1850, through the 1850s into the 1860s. This was the center of the California gold rush. And I'd visit these old ghost towns and the mining camps, and I was just intrigued by the fact that this is now very rural. They're kind of mountain resorts, a few things you see like that, but it has nowhere near the population it had in the 1850s. Now this is striking because, at least in the United States, you get used to the idea that cities get bigger. But there were towns of 10,000, 15,000 people that had just vanished when the gold ran out. And no reason to stay, so off they'd go. So I had been through the gold country, and I'd seen where the gold came from. There wasn't much gold left, but I'd seen where the gold came from. And I saw what some of the gold added up to in this golden spike that's in the Stanford Museum. And I knew the story of how it connected. It was the last thing driven in to connect finally the two lines that were constructed from east and from west. And by the way, after the golden spike was pounded in, and it was connected to telegraph lines so that immediately the news would flash to east and to west, so everybody would know that the construction job had been completed. They quickly dug it up. They were going to leave it there for somebody to come get it, so they dug it up and gave it to Stanford and went in his museum. So anyway, I knew about this, and I was sort of vaguely aware that there was this bubbling going on in the vicinity of Stanford University, in I'll now call it Silicon Valley, because I think it was in 1972 that the first person used the label Silicon Valley. It didn't catch on for a while, but eventually it did. And when it did, by the time it did, I was out of college, and I would occasionally visit California, but I never lived there again. And I just sort of watched from a distance as Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. And by this time, I'd gone into the field of history. I was a historian, and I asked myself, so why Silicon Valley? As I say, when I used to go on my bike rides around, there was nothing that was indicated there's a tech explosion, there's this explosion of wealth, and this is critical, there's this explosion of wealth that is going to happen, that is happening right here, the beginnings that are here. So why did it happen? Well, in time, I decided to write a book about California history. But it was really focusing on the gold rush period. And I wrote a book, it was called The Age of Gold. And for the book, I went back to the gold country, and I travel around the gold country and look at the old mines, and I saw the place where the first gold nugget was discovered. I even went to, on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley, There's a historical library and archive called the Bancroft Library, and there they have the first gold nugget that a guy named James Marshall discovered in 1848 that gave rise to the gold rush of the following year, 1849. And so I researched and I wrote the story of the California gold rush. Now, somewhere in the back of my mind, I was thinking about that gold spike in the museum on the Stanford campus. I was thinking about this phenomenon that had occurred in the intervening 30 years. So I think my book came out in 2004, 2005. So Silicon Valley was a real deal by then. And I was asking myself, well, I saw the physical connection between the gold rush era and Silicon Valley. It's that gold spike that's there. I mean, it's this physical thing. It came out of the ground in the gold rush, and it's there in the Stanford Museum. And all around, I'd been back to the Stanford campus a few times, and boy, you could see that Silicon Valley had boomed around it. And in fact, this idea of a partnership between a university and a surrounding industry had taken off. And those nondescript offices that I had seen along Sand Hill Road, some of them were torn down and rebuilt, but some were simply repurposed for the creation of a new kind of industry. And the industry was the venture capital industry. And what venture capitalists do is make bets on new technologies. And they make investments into new ideas, new companies, where somebody has a bright idea and says, okay, I got this bright idea for, I'm going to make this thing called, I'm going to call it a search engine. And it's going to be used on this thing called the internet. And it's going to help people find what they're looking for. And the two guys who came up with this happened to be graduate students at Stanford, and they were Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And they were the founders of Google. And Google, by the way, is the fourth or fifth most valuable. It's called, its parent company is Alphabet. It's one of the fourth or fifth largest companies in the world today. And it came right out of Silicon Valley and the venture capital industry, and this connection between the university, as I say, they were graduate students, and this new tech industry. So I was asking myself, as the historian of the gold rush and as somebody who's just kind of interested in how all this stuff fits together, why Silicon Valley? Why did this not happen in Houston? Or why didn't it happen in New York or Chicago or someplace else? In fact, it didn't even happen in San Francisco. It didn't happen in the biggest city or San Jose and the cities in the area. It happened in these suburbs. Why there? And I came up with a theory. And I'm not sure anybody else buys the theory, but I'll explain the theory to you and you can decide whether you think it's reasonable. In the time period, at the time when I was in college and Silicon Valley was just getting started, if someone had been interested in guessing or making a bet on where this tech revolution is going to occur, and by the early 1970s, there were a lot of signs that something big was going to happen because this transistor that I identified was now 15 years old and people are figuring out how to use it and make integrated circuits so you could put a lot of transistors on a single chip and so on. So if you were a betting person, where would you place your bet? Would you place it on this suburban area in the South Bay? I don't know. In fact, smart money might well have gone clear to the other side of the continent, to the vicinity of Boston, and not downtown Boston, but particularly around Cambridge, Massachusetts. Why Cambridge, Massachusetts? Well, because Cambridge, Massachusetts has a couple of pretty good universities, MIT and Harvard. And both of these have very respected and very distinguished computer science, electrical engineering programs. And so the same kind of synergy that one did find around Stanford, and by the way, it wasn't just Stanford, the University of California, Berkeley. Berkeley is just on the other side of the bay, in the East Bay. And so it contributed a lot to this thing that became Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley had Stanford and Berkeley, but Boston, the loop around Boston is Route 128, so it has Harvard and MIT. Silicon Valley also had this pre-existing company, Hewlett-Packard. And so it was like the seed that's going to grow into this larger thing. But there were companies comparable to Hewlett-Packard in the vicinity of Boston. And, Boston's a bigger city and it's more established. And so you might very well have thought, okay, that's where the tech revolution is going to occur. But it didn't. It occurred in California. It occurred in Silicon Valley. So why was this so? So here's my theory. Well, I told you that I've written about the California gold rush. Okay? I also wrote a book a little bit earlier about Benjamin Franklin. And in my head, I had this idea of two models of American success. And one model I associated with Benjamin Franklin. So how do you succeed? How do you get ahead in America? One model is associated with Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin was the author of Poor Richard's Almanac, which had some very handy advice like early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, wise. A penny saved is a penny earned, and so on. This was advice for the struggling young man in those days who wants to get ahead in the world. And the Benjamin Franklin model of success was cultivate those virtues, those useful virtues, and apply them, and over a period of decades, then you will get ahead. You will succeed. You won't become enormously wealthy, but you'll have a modest success. Benjamin Franklin was wealthy enough that he was able to retire from active work in his mid-40s and go on to do other things, go on to become famous and all the stuff that's associated with Benjamin Franklin. So that's one model, but there was something that was very Boston about it. It was connected to the old Puritan ideas that material success is related to the state of one's soul. You have to have these virtues in order to achieve material success. Hold that thought. Because off in California, in the gold rush, there is this other model that is developing. And it's a model that's based not on modesty and virtue like that. It's based on the willingness to take risks. It's based on gambling. And it was the model that emerged in the California gold rush because people could hunt for gold, and sometimes they found it, sometimes they didn't. If they didn't find it, they didn't think it was their fault. They'd just go on and try something else. I imagined two miners out in California. Miners, they could also be, they were panning for gold, and they'd be standing in this rushing cold stream, and one guy would reach down in the water and pick up a rock. It's just a rock, not worth anything. And the guy right next to him, the claims are very small, the guy right next to him would reach down and pick up a nugget of gold. And the guy who picked up the nugget of gold said, "I'm lucky, I'm rich." And the guy who picked up the rock, he wouldn't say, "Oh my God, there's something wrong with me." He didn't beat his breast and hang his head and say, I need to get right with God and the world. No, he said, I got to go try someplace else, try again. So what emerged in California was an appetite for risk and the idea that you could fail and fail and fail and fail and fail until finally you would succeed. What the California gold rush did was to normalize failure. In fact, it no longer was failure a comment on the state of your soul. Failure was just something you get over and try again. And I would suggest that it was this friendliness to risk, this willing to take risks, that separated Silicon Valley from Boston. In Boston, there still was this idea, because Boston finance is more conservative than California finance. And in the venture capital industry, this is what Silicon Valley had that Boston didn't have. Because in the venture capital industry, you have to be willing to place 20 bets, knowing that 19 of them are going to fail, but the 20th is going to succeed so grandly that it'll make you and everybody involved rich. There wasn't that appetite. In Boston, 19 out of 20 failures, that's a really bad record. We're not going to do that. And it was this willingness to take risks that separated California from Boston, that made, at least according to my theory, made it most likely that Silicon Valley would emerge in Silicon Valley. It would emerge in California, where the gold rush had occurred a bit over a century before. I think there was enough of that experience of take risks, gamble, fail, get up, try again, and eventually it'll pay off. There was enough of that mindset that separated the West Coast from the East Coast. And made it happen. That Silicon Valley emerged in Silicon Valley. So anyway, that's my explanation for why Silicon Valley.